Okay, guys, so before I end today's class, I really want to talk about gender and age with regard to eating disorders, because some of the stereotypes that folks have about the sort of typical person at risk for an eating disorder is not necessarily the case. And as a result of that, there might be diagnostic bias where folks miss the eating disorder in someone who doesn't fit the stereotype, whether that be in terms of gender or in terms of age. These next two slides, and this video is going to cover both of them. These next two slides are about what we know regarding gender and age and risk for eating disorders. So before we get started, I would love it if you guys would take a moment to watch the brief segment on slide number 14. At the top, I gave you the link for a segment on eating disorders as it relates to gender, and you will see interviews with both a young male and a young female, both of whom have eating disorders and the types of things that they were engaging in to kind of break the stereotype that this is just a female problem, a young female problem. I did mention to you on an earlier slide that because of diagnostic bias, it may be the case that only females, young females, are more likely to come to the attention of clinical diagnosis and therefore get help when there are males suffering as well. So take a look at that, please, eating disorders across gender, and then meet me right back here for the rest of this slide and the discussion that will ensue. I will go on, assuming you did that and then came back. If you haven't, please do that. I want to talk about the female athlete triad. The female athlete triad has been studied with regard to disordered eating patterns. Female athlete triad, you can imagine triad must mean there's three characteristics, and there are, number one, disordered eating patterns. Now, this may or may not move from subclinical to a diagnosis. And you know what subclinical is because I talked about it earlier in today's class. This is done specifically, this disordered eating, to enhance performance in one's sport. Number two, loss of menstrual periods, so that amenorrhea that I mentioned on the prior slide as a physiological consequence of eating disorders. We see this in the female athlete triad. And again, that decrease in estrogen. Let's try this again. That decrease in the ability to store estrogen because of insufficient fat being taken in is what's leading to that. And number three, as I mentioned on the prior slide in my physiological consequences of eating disorders, osteoporosis, which again, loss of calcium and estrogen from improper nutritional intake results in brittle bones. This is relevant to what we're going to talk about in our next class on Thursday, that secondary compulsive exercise, that secondary exercise addiction, because we see that in female athletes as part of this female athlete triad. Interesting studies by a researcher named Anderson. So much research has focused on females and eating disorders, but now there is a growing body of research over the past, I'd say, 7 years or so, involving males and eating disorders. And Anderson was interested in the similarities and potential differences between males and females who are diagnosed with eating disorder patterns. Here is what Anderson found. Number one, males are typically overweight before they develop eating disorders, whereas females believe that they are overweight, but are actually near weight that they should be for their height or average weight. Number two, males who develop eating disorders are often participating in sports that require explicit weight limits. And so they might be initially driven to these disordered eating patterns as an attempt to meet the weight restriction requirements of their sport. For example, jockeys, wrestlers, runners, swimmers, right? These are sports wherein either you have to be in a weight class, like jockeys and wrestlers, or you have to maintain a certain weight to be effective in your performance. Like the lighter a jockey is, the better they'll do with their horse race. Runners and swimmers will be able to be faster if they have less weight to carry around. Number three, Anderson found that males who develop eating disorders commonly experience comorbid substance abuse and alcohol problems. Now, I said that was common for bulimia in general. This seems to be common in males who develop eating disorders. Number 4, one of the fastest growing types of eating disorders in males is, you know this from last class, reverse anorexia, as it's called, or muscle dysmorphia. And I'm not even going to say anything else about it because I spent a lot of time at the end of last class talking about it. Number 5, Anderson found that a new study reviewed in Anderson's work suggested the percentage difference in diagnosis between males and females is misleading because males are less likely to seek treatment than females for their eating disorder symptoms. That was a study done by Woodside that Anderson reviewed. So again, we get to this diagnostic bias. Maybe one of the reasons more females than males are diagnosed with eating disorders by professionals is they're more likely to actually seek treatment. And we know this is true in general for any health problem, that females are more likely to seek treatment. And finally, number 6, Anderson found more homosexual males than heterosexual males are diagnosed with eating disorders, but that could be because many heterosexual males are what researchers refer to as, quote, silent sufferers, meaning they have a stigma in their mind they've associated with admitting they have an eating disorder, whether they believe that's a female problem or a problem of gay men only, or they don't want other people to think badly of them because of it, because they think men shouldn't have eating disorders. They fear stigma. They don't report. They don't seek treatment. So we don't know that they actually have the eating disorder. So it's hard to know if the fact that more homosexual males are diagnosed with eating disorders is because they actually have a higher rate of eating disorders, or they're just more likely to seek treatment than heterosexual males. That is something that research needs to tease apart with future research data collected. And finally, males and females. So those were the differences Anderson studied between males and females with eating disorders. Now I want to tell you what the studies indicate the similarities are. Both males and females who develop eating disorders have very low self-esteem. They have a strong need for acceptance from others. They tend to acquiesce to peer pressure, meaning they tend to be influenced by peer pressure. And that also is related to their need for acceptance. They tend to have depression, and this shouldn't be surprising because I mentioned in my prior slides in this lecture that depression and anxiety disorders are commonly comorbid with eating disorders. Males and females diagnosed with eating disorders both have poor body image and body image concerns. They have anxiety, which again shouldn't be surprising because anxiety and depression are often comorbid with eating disorders. They have poor coping skills, males and females diagnosed with eating disorders. Poor coping skills for dealing with personal and emotional issues. That takes us back to that emotion-focused coping. Both males and females who develop eating disorders tend to be emotion-focused copers, and you guys know what that means because I've talked about it in today's class and I talked about it in previous classes, right? A tendency to try harder to eliminate the uncomfortable emotions associated with stressors rather than the source of the stress itself. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide, and I also want you on the next and final slide before we go to class business, I want you to watch a brief news segment on the video clip I've pasted in for you. This is a relatively brief clip. I'm speaking with a professional who studies and treats eating disorders about the rise in eating disorders in people of middle age, particularly middle-aged women. So there is a rise of anorexia, for example, in middle-aged women. So again, I want you to take a moment to stop, watch the brief segment, and then come back to me. Come on back and finish this with me before I go to class business. Okay, so I'm going to go on with the assumption that you watched the video segment. So there is an estimated 1 to 3 million middle-aged women in the United States alone suffering from anorexia or bulimia. That's pretty amazing because the stereotype is that eating disorders are a young disorder, a teenage disorder, right? people generally weren't thinking until recently about middle-aged women. Now, what the studies suggest is that when middle-aged women develop anorexia, it seems to be triggered initially by stressful events, such as loss or perceived loss. That could be ailing parents. That could be children moving out and empty nest syndrome, going to college, things like that. It could be divorce at midlife or the death of a parent. It could be traumatic illness, such as developing cancer, such as breast cancer or heart disease, or autoimmune disorders like lupus, which often onsets in middle age. And also the aging process. The individual, as she ages, becomes dissatisfied with the way her face and body looks with age, and wants to try to rectify that in some way by restricting food and trying to fix this perceived change in the body. In addition to that, studies indicate that the rise of eating disorders in middle-aged women seems to be somewhat socioculturally influenced. So I want you to think about, way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about the biopsychosocial spiritual model, right? This is a sociocultural factor. The influence of rising cultural pressure on middle-aged women to reach a physical beauty ideal, to maintain thinness, to achieve standards of beauty. And as we age, this becomes more difficult because our metabolic rate slows down as we age. For women especially, estrogen levels drop considerably after 35, especially after 40, and certainly after 45. So it becomes easier for women to gain weight at middle age as estrogen levels are dropping, especially around women around the midsection. As estrogen levels drop, women tend to start to gain weight around their stomach, lower stomach area, around the abdomen. Metabolic rate slows down in women and men as aging progresses. And so these very real changes in the physiological processes of the body make it harder for women to maintain the ideal beauty physical type, and that can trigger concerns about food intake. Additionally, depression in middle-aged women has emerged from research as a trigger, which is very similar to their younger counterparts. I have been saying repeatedly in this lecture, depression and anxiety disorders are often comorbid with eating disorders, and that disordered eating patterns may be a way to cope with these uncomfortable emotional and cognitive states. The same is true, it appears to be, for middle-aged women. And finally, just like their younger counterparts who develop eating disorders, middle-aged women who develop eating disorders tend to have low self-esteem, low self-worth, and perfectionistic. That's number 6. Perfectionistic, not perfectionistic. That's not a word. Perfectionistic high achievement standards, right? So we see some similarities and some differences between the potential triggers of eating disorder behaviors and patterns and cognitions and so forth in our younger and our middle-aged sufferers. We are going to end there, everybody, and I am going to give you a class business video, and we're going to end for today, and I will see you guys on Thursday where we pick up this discussion. Now that you really understand eating disorders, we're going to pick up our discussion on secondary exercise addiction. I will see you then. Y'all have a good night.